So the area of the world that I work in primarily is the ancient Near East, Eastern Mediterranean, where I specialize in what is now Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, with a little bit of Iraq, a little bit of Egypt, and a little bit of Greece thrown into the mix. So in talking about language and culture, I'm going to start out with one of the things I bring up with my ancient Hebrew class about the value of learning an ancient language that's been translated over and over again. So we'll just start with the first word in the Old Testament, which here in Hebrew is Bereshit, and is often translated as in the beginning. And I just like to use this one as an example for my Hebrew class, and there's a few of my Hebrew students in here, about the importance of this, because from a Hebrew perspective, there's no way that you should be able to translate this as in the beginning. It has to be when beginning, while beginning, something along those lines. And so even though we are so used to thinking of the Bible starting out as in the beginning, it can't possibly begin that way, at least from the Hebrew perspective, from the way that the text has been received. And that's in line with what we know of other creation stories from the ancient Mesopotamian world, where we get a similar kind of sense of getting the creation story that we're told beginning kind of in the middle of the action, not at the right at the start. So moving a little bit later in the text, we go on to Genesis 1-6, and I like this section because it points out some of the real difficulties in translating and how when you sort of dig into the translation, you can get a better sense of the cultural world of the people you're studying. So this is Genesis 1-6, and the NRSV translation, which is a pretty standard translation, reads, "And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Which is already, if you're trying to think about what this means, is kind of a strange thing. The word in question is this word rakia, which often in tradition has been translated as firmament or something along those lines. But what this really does, if you want to try to understand this verse on its own terms and understand the ancient world that this comes from, then you get a really interesting view of what the ancient Israelite worldview was like, what they actually thought the earth looked like in the Iron Age. And so we have this flat earth, and we have waters that are split in half. And what the story in Genesis tells us is that God has split these waters in two and used this dome-like thing to keep some of the waters up above and to stop those waters from falling down upon us. Now, there end up being little holes in this firmament, and those holes are how rain comes. And so when it starts to rain, there are little holes through which this comes out of, or the waters bubble up from below. And so this translation here, you kind of get that sense that there'll be a dome in the midst of the waters, but it's easy to miss that. And so the point of doing this kind of work is to get this larger sense of what the ancient Israelites really thought of their world around them. So that's more of like a cosmological scientific approach, but we can do the same kind of things with sort of literary approaches and sort of get a sense of different kinds of social scientific aspects of Israelite culture. There's a painting of a story from the book of Judges about one of the sort of military leaders of the Israelites named Jephthah. And Jephthah is off fighting the Ammonites. And we have one of the world experts in the Ammonites over here in the audience, Walter Aufrecht, right? So Jephthah is fighting the Ammonites. And what he wants to do is he asks God, please give me a victory of the Ammonites. If I succeed, then I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house when I return home safely. Now that seems like a bad kind of vow to make, right? And certainly with our houses, you think, okay, that's not going to be good for me in the long term. My master supervisor believed that this is because there were sheep in the basement of houses usually, and so the expectation was that Jephthah thought that a sheep or a goat would come out of the house, and that's what he would sacrifice. But when he arrives home, it is his daughter that comes out to greet him, and while she's happy to see him return, he's not so happy that she's come out of the house and announces to her that he is going to have to sacrifice her. So what happens is she sort of agrees to this, and in this typical translation, she says, "And she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months so that I may go and wander in the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I. Go, he said, and he sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow he had made. She had never slept with a man." All right, so the typical reading of this is to use this term virginity for the Hebrew word Betul that is in there. And Betul kind of has a sense of maiden that we would use in this older, sort of archaic English, where it's a sense that this is a woman of marriageable age that isn't married yet. But I think that translators have often gotten this idea wrong and the point of this passage incorrect, because they kind of they concentrate on this last sentence, she had never slept with a man, right? And that's what she's sad about, and that's what she's off mourning with her friends about. But the sense of Betul is really more like a sense of a sodality, like the age group, the people that were her friends around her. And what's, I think, glossed over by using a translation like virginity is this insight into female social lives, and that this is sort of just a hint that for young unmarried women, they had a larger social group that they would be enacting with and engaging with, and she's gone off with her friends to sort of be mournful about how that friendship is going to go away. So I think here are sort of two examples of how we can look deep down at the language, these ancient languages, and try to get at sort of more interesting insights into the ancient world. So when I'm teaching Hebrew, one of the curious things about that course is I'm really teaching students to read one book, right? They're reading the Old Testament, but they're reading this particular version of the Old Testament, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is a form of the text that came into being around 650, 700 AD. And the particular version that they're learning to read is based off of the Leningrad Codex, one copy of the book that comes from about 1008, 1009 CE, right, AD. So it's a very, very peculiar kind of thing to be studying in some ways, right, because it's such an ultra-specific kind of skill. But it points to sort of the importance of language in any given culture, because the people that created this codex, right, or at least that created the version that this became copied of, were so convinced of the sacrality of the text, of the importance of this text, that they wanted it to be preserved in as accurate of detail as they possibly could. But they also believed that their pronunciations of the words were the correct ones, and they didn't want people to mistakenly pronounce the sacred text in other ways. So what they've done is, you can see these little points throughout. These are all markers about how to pronounce the words, the vowel sounds, and over here are sort of critical notes for the text, because they didn't feel like they could move the text around at all. They'd have to fill things around in the margins because of the importance of this. And they were so convinced of the importance of their pronunciations, they destroyed other copies. And so we have very few other copies of the Old Testament that have survived. We have a few, but this is why things like the Dead Sea Scrolls are of such great interest to people, because the Masoretes, the people that compiled that earlier version, that other version of the Hebrew Bible, didn't know about these editions of the text, and so weren't able to destroy them. So they give us some other insight into how those texts could have been written. So my own specialty is from a little bit earlier than Hebrew, a related language, but earlier, a language called Ugaritic, spoken at a site called Ugart in Syria. This is a language that we have texts from for about 100 years of its history, right before the city was destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Most of the texts are administrative texts or letters, political treaties, things like that. There is some literary text. This is a fragment of the Baal cycle, and it's a cycle of texts about the god Baal, who's one of the gods that in the Old Testament you're told not to worship, right? So it's fun to have stories from his perspective and his worshippers' perspectives to contrast with that. And Ugaritic, like Hebrew, is an alphabetic language, but Ugaritic is written in cuneiform on tablets and clay tablets and incised in. And so this text is what we call an abecedery. It's just a scribe practicing writing out the alphabet over and over again. And so we have a few of these from Ugart where we can see the alphabet as written. And one of the things that's typical of Northwest Semitic languages is that vowels are not preserved in the language. We only have consonants. And so at first that seems like a real issue in terms of thinking about, like, how could anybody actually have read this? But if you know the language, there's not really a problem with trying to understand what it says without vowels, right? We can all see frozen cold here, right? We can guess that from the Slurpee machine. But it becomes a problem. We no longer have contemporary knowledge of the language. We don't have native speakers anymore. And so this plays a role in some of the pronunciation difficulties we have with varieties of languages. So Egyptian is one of these languages where we know that the Egyptians thought that their country's name was KMT. But we don't have any idea what the vowels are. There's different suggestions, Kumtu, Kumat, things like that. We don't really know. The symbol over here, though, we can pronounce as an Ankh, and that's sort of a symbol. Some of you might have this tattooed on you somewhere, but this is the Egyptian symbol for life. And so we know that it has this A sound because Ankh is preserved in a later living language that's derived from Egyptian Coptic, the language of the Christians in Egypt. And so we can pronounce some of these words and some of these signs. So for things like Ankh, we're pretty confident using an A sound. But other Egyptian words, we don't know how to pronounce them, so we just insert little E's between them so we can actually pronounce the things instead of just saying like "kumt" all the time or something like that, right? But it's an artificial approach to trying to reconstruct the language. But when you have a living language like Coptic, it gives us some access to some of the things. So my specialty is in cuneiform languages. Cuneiform languages are these languages like Ugaritic where there is a tablet and you incise with little wedges. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped in Latin. And there's all sorts of languages written in cuneiform. Sumerian is probably our oldest written language. There's Akkadian, which was incredibly common language spoken throughout the ancient world until Hellenistic times. Hittite is an Indo-European language that's spoken in Turkey. Ugaritic, all sorts of these languages. And what we end up finding in a dig site, if you are lucky enough, or maybe not lucky if you don't want to do the paperwork, but you find tablets like this all sort of strewn about. And it's really the accident that these things were written in clay that allows us to have access to these languages. So we know that in ancient Israel there was lots of writing, but that writing was in papyrus. And because papyrus doesn't survive archaeologically, we don't have direct access in the same way. But for the Mesopotamian world, we have tablets written in clay, and clay doesn't break down over time. So we have literally thousands and thousands of tablets that we can read through. And so this is where our Mesopotamian literature is preserved. Some great pieces of literature from world history, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is tablet 11, which is a break in the main story of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh learns about the flood that destroyed ancient Mesopotamia. And so when this tablet was first deciphered in the 1870s, it created a firestorm of interest in Mesopotamian studies, and it led to this sort of erroneous belief that there are flood myths all around the world where everybody believed that a flood destroyed the world, when that's not really actually the case. So cuneiform writing is an incredibly complex writing system. In the early stages, you can see up here, the signs will initially look something like what they represent. And so by the time they sort of develop over and over, by the final stage, you would never be able to guess that this was supposed to look like a fish, right? It's completely abstracted. And that this sign can actually mean the word fish. It could represent that the next word coming up is going to be a fish, or it could just be a sound. And in this case, it could be the sound gir, kir, kir, bish, pish, pis, pisha, bis, push, kiri, kar, anything like that. And so the only way that you can sort out which exact sound it's supposed to represent is through the context of the other signs that are in the translation. So incredibly complex system. In ancient times, there were scribal schools where people learned these skills, learned how to write. And we have lots of remnants of scribal schools that are apparent in the archaeological record. That's actually a lot of our tablets are actually just scribal exercises, scribes practicing of various sorts. Some are just lists of signs and their values. Others are actually like word lists, bilingual texts. And those bilingual texts that were recorded were key for us to be able to translate and decipher these languages. Because you can't just figure out one of these languages on its own. You need some kind of key, some kind of entryway into it. And so because we had those for Akkadian and Mesopotamian languages, we're able to make sense of those languages in the 19th century. So this is an inscription called the Behistun inscription, which is in Iran. It's an inscription written by the Persian king Darius, or commissioned by the Persian king Darius. And here you can get a sense of the extreme location. Here's another shot showing maybe before some safety protocols were put in. You can tell by the age of letting the kids run around up on top of this thing. All right, and so the inscription itself, this is an older version of it, but the inscription itself has writing in Old Persian, which people could read, Elamite, an ancient Iranian language, and Akkadian, an ancient Mesopotamian language. And the Old Persian had a king list that was the same as the one in Herodotus. And so scholars working with this inscription and other inscriptions like this were able to sort out and eventually decipher the Akkadian language. And so these two men are usually credited with the ones who were deciphering it, but usually these sort of stories are made a bit more simple. But eventually, 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society decides that they're going to have a test to prove if Akkadian has actually been deciphered properly. So they give the same text to these 4 scholars and have them go off and translate this text by themselves. And the idea was, if the text ends up being translated relatively similarly, then the language has been cracked. If it's too different, then it's just something they're making up and they're not actually accurate. So 3 of the 4 attempts were successful and close enough to one another that the Royal Asiatic Society declared that Akkadian had been translated. And from that point on, we've been able to develop enough research on Akkadian and work through enough tablets that we have a really, really good understanding of the grammar of Akkadian, the language of Akkadian, and we can gain access to Mesopotamian literature in that way. But these tablets, the things that they're preserved on, are really charismatic. And that leads to sort of one of the major dangers that we have now for studying ancient Mesopotamian culture is the amount of looting that's gone on since the region's been destabilized with the British-American invasion at the turn of the millennium. And so now what happens at sites, depending on the location and the political issues of the time, is you get roving gangs of looters that show up on the site. And these looting gangs are kind of organized the same way as American drug gangs are in American cities, where you have like a foreman with the machine gun and the rifles, and you have lower level workers who are digging and looting away at tablets. And all of these tablets, these guys get paid a minimal amount per day. This guy gets a bit more, and by the time they get to Switzerland, right, they are fetching millions of dollars through private collectors who are buying these things illegally. And this is a real problem in our field. This is a site that's been excavated, and every one of these pits is a looter's pit, right? There's hundreds of them at the site, and these things are just being dug up and sold away. And so here is a box of artifacts that have been looted that had been seized by the Iraqi Antiquities Authority. You can see that some of these things have numbers on them, which means they're actually stolen from a museum. And these are all things that are being sold and looted on the black market. So a real genuine concern for the field, because once these tablets are out of the ground and out of the context, it's hard to actually make sense of what they mean or what their historical importance is. So these languages are charismatic. These writing systems have always been charismatic, and there are hints of the kind of magical feeling towards these languages. This is a drawing of some hieroglyphs from a coffin from Egypt, I should say. And what the scribe has done, or the painter or the artist, it's kind of hard to differentiate between them, they've mutilated the animals. And they've done that because the idea is that in the actual tomb, these words will actually come to life, right? So if you're dead and you're buried in your tomb, you have things like this put into your tomb, so you'll gain access to them in the afterlife. Now, the problem with the Egyptian writing system is that you have things like snakes or hornets and things like that. So you don't necessarily want to wake up from your death and have all these hornets and snakes roaming about your tomb. So the solution these artists have come up with is to make it so that the animals are decapitated. So this poor snake has no tail, so it can't move. The hornet, or whatever this is, has no head. The geese can't run away because they have no feet, right? And so it's a solution to deal with sort of the magical element of the script. We get a similar kind of thing, or similar kinds of magical treatment in other ways. This up top is known as the Tetragrammaton. That is God's name in the Hebrew Bible, right? It's his personal name. This word below is the word Adonai, which means my Lord. So the Masoretes, these people that put out the Bible in the form that I was showing you earlier, what they did is they were really worried that as you're reading the Bible, you might accidentally say God's name. You might pronounce it out loud. And one of the 10 Commandments is to not take the Lord's name in vain. So you might be reading along and you might accidentally take the Lord's name in vain. This is kind of a problem, right? So just to avoid it, in case you're reading aloud, you're going to read it, but the vowels are going to be wrong and you're going to stumble over them and get the wrong words. So how this looks is, instead of being the way you'd properly pronounce God, or how we think you pronounce God's name, this says Yehovah. And so that's how we get this medieval sense that God's name is Jehovah, and that's where the term Jehovah comes from, is from this pointing of the name. So ancient people had a sense that the script had this kind of charismatic, erratic power, and contemporary scholars and scientists have had similar ideas about this. And it goes beyond just this sense that the words themselves have sort of hidden powers or magic, but there's even a sense that the material culture itself is encoded with different messages that you can gain from the study of these things. So this guy's name is Piazza Smith, he was a member of the Royal Geographic Society, and he went to Egypt to measure the pyramids. And his measurements weren't necessarily great because they didn't clear the base of the pyramid enough, but he was able to measure pretty accurately the interior of the pyramid. He was using all the kind of cartographic measuring kind of skills that the Victorians are famous for. But he did this because he thought that the pyramid's use was misunderstood. It was not actually meant to be the burial place of a king. This was a monument that God had created to tell people what metrology should be like. It is a monument to measurement. And the point of the pyramid is to embed what a sacred cubit is, so that all the generations of the world would know from this point on what the sacred cubit is. And so he writes this gigantic volume, and in it, he just tears a strip out of the French for daring to come up with a metrical system, and he accuses them of trying to abolish Christianity, burn the Bible, declare God to be a non-existence, a mere invention of the priests, an institute of worship of humanity or of themselves, and their title of goddess of reason, etc., because by abandoning the British inch, which he said coincidentally was the same as the sacred cubit of ancient times, they are actually defying God through this kind of measurement technique. So that's, then further on, him and one of his friends start to study. They think that these chambers actually have secret codes embedded in them. And those secret codes tell about biblical prophecy. And so by accurately measuring the interior of the pyramid, you can find major biblical events, and from this they are able to predict when the end of the world would come, which is 1908. So you get all sorts of this kind of speculation from pyramids, from the material culture of the ancient world, that leads to a variety of different kinds of imagination where you're not constrained by the text. You take the text, you see the language, but in some ways, not engaging with the language allows you to make sort of further claims. So here are a number of people using sort of pyramid power ideas, right? And you might have heard about these things, like if you put your razors under a pyramid, it'll magically sharpen them. The Summerhill Winery in Kelowna uses a gigantic pyramid to make their wine taste really good, and I think it does. And if you'd like me to fund this project, I'd be glad to go and study this further. Right? But this is sort of, there's even more mainstream versions of this. So Sigmund Freud, right, was greatly interested in ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East. And he used his office, his desk with all these artifacts that he'd collected. And his last book is a book where he's trying to describe Moses in ancient Egypt. And most of the claims he makes aren't very accurate, but really what he's trying to do is figure out the origins of anti-Semitism in Europe through a historical analysis. But if you look into some of his other works, you can see that engaging with hieroglyphs has been really important to his interpretations. And so in the interpretation of dreams, he's very explicit in describing how him studying how people used ancient Egyptian and how they understood Egyptian actually leads him to develop his system for interpreting dreams. So one of the things he suggests is that, like in ancient Egyptian writing, there will be a symbol that will appear that will tell you what the next words are going to be. He argues that dreams have the same kind of syntax, and there will be these words like that, these sort of ideas or images that will appear in a dream to tell you what kind of dream you're having. And this comes on to be adopted in Freudian dream interpretation. There's all sorts of elements like this embedded into his work, but I think my time is up now, so I will stop and pass the mic over.